Picture this. You're imprisoned in a cold stone chamber, deep under the most famous arena ever constructed. Just hours ago, 50,000 Roman citizens watched as your spouse was killed by a wild beast in the arena above. Now the spectators are heading home. The flames from the torches grow dim. Then you detect footsteps, slow, purposeful, approaching steadily. A figure blocks the light from your doorway. It's one of the fighters who made it through today's bloodshed. His body is stained with blood from his opponents. A prison guard opens your cell door. The fighter gestures toward you. This isn't something from a fictional thriller. This was an ordinary day in ancient Rome. I'm about to reveal the aspect of Roman civilization that rarely appears in textbooks, the organized government-run horror that unfolded when the spectators returned to their homes. This isn't guesswork or theory. Roman authors documented it themselves, and physical proof remains carved into the stones under the Colosseum. By the time you finish watching, your understanding of ancient Rome will be forever changed. The entertainment industry has misrepresented gladiators for generations. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus, they display the violence and fighting, the honor and uprisings. What they leave out is what transpired during those hours after the games concluded. When public entertainment shifted into something far darker, I'm describing a practice so troubling that contemporary scholars invented a fresh Latin phrase for it, victoria carnalis, victory of the flesh. The Romans themselves never used that specific term, because for them it wasn't unusual enough to require special terminology. It was simply routine. Here's what the historical record confirms. Writers from Rome, including Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca, described a reality where women taken in conquest were stored underneath arenas and given away as rewards, not symbolically, actually distributed like supplies to fighters who excelled in combat. The Roman government, the state apparatus itself, ran this operation with the same organized precision they applied to constructing water systems and highways. Consider the implications. The identical culture that introduced us to concrete construction and democratic governance also refined the mechanization of sexual brutality. Before I continue deeper, I need you to take action. Look at the like button at this moment. If you think forgotten history should be brought to light, even when it's disturbing, press that button and leave a comment saying where on earth you're watching from, because this account isn't just about Rome. It's about what powerful nations do when nobody's paying attention. Now let's go down into the hypogam. To grasp what occurred in those subterranean rooms, you must first understand how Rome converted human beings into commodities. This wasn't arbitrary violence, this was organized dehumanization on a factory-like magnitude, and it began the instant Roman armies seized new lands. When Rome defeated a rebellion in Gaul or destroyed a settlement in Judea, they didn't merely claim victory in combat, they processed entire populations. It resembled an assembly line designed for human misery. Men who could fight were dispatched to perish in quarries or fighting pits. Young ones were traded to slave auctions throughout the territories. Women were classified as captiva, prizes of war owned by the government. Here's the truly frightening part. According to Roman legal codes, these individuals weren't legally recognized as human beings anymore. They were categorized as arias, objects, possessions, the identical legal classification as furniture or farm animals. A captured woman possessed no more legal protections than a piece of wood. You could inflict anything upon her and it wasn't even technically illegal, because you cannot break laws against an item. But Rome didn't just strip humanity through legislation. They stripped it through public display. The arena events weren't merely amusement. They were political demonstrations engineered to psychologically crush both the defeated and Rome's own population. When you witnessed a captured tribal leader from Germania battle a lion, you weren't just observing a death. You were watching Rome prove what awaits anyone who challenges the empire. And during the midday break, when wealthy citizens departed for their meals, that's when events became genuinely cruel. Scholars label these executions fatal performances, mythological recreations, where doomed captives were compelled to portray famous legends, except the killings were authentic. The writer Martial, composing in the 1st century, depicts these moments with shocking nonchalance, as if he's critiquing a meal. He documents a captive costumed as Orpheus, the mythical musician whose melodies could captivate any being with his performance. They brought him into the fighting ground where the instrument released a bear. Martial observes, somewhat let down, that on this occasion the melody failed to work, as the bear killed the man, while 50,000 spectators consumed sweetened fruit. In a different section, and I'm cautioning you, this is profoundly upsetting, Martial describes a woman compelled to recreate the legend of Pasiphae, who coupled with a consecrated bull. For this captive it involved being publicly violated by a creature before thousands of observers, until she succumbed from her wounds. Absorb that information again. The Roman government created a mechanism where people were violated to death by beasts as midday amusement. This wasn't the disturbed imagination of a single insane ruler. This was standard practice spanning decades. Government officials brought their offspring to observe. The spectacles were promoted on structures across the city. Merchants sold refreshments. Martial himself remarks that whatever legends describe, the arena brings to reality. But here's the aspect that should alarm you. He's composing this as praise. He's applauding the effectiveness of the operation. This was the context. This mechanized bureaucratic apparatus of cruelty that also transformed conquered women into the compensation structure for arena fighters. Now let's discuss the men who collected these compensations. Gladiators occupied a strange paradox that Rome never completely addressed. They were at once the most despised and most celebrated figures in society, enslaved people with fewer legal protections than animals, yet famous personalities whose images decorated household art, and whose identities were scrawled on structures by devoted admirers. Aristocratic women were fascinated by them. Men preserved writing from Pompeii labels one fighter as the dream of women and another as the pride of females. There are verified accounts of upper-class women sneaking into fighter quarters, bribing sentries for secret meetings. The gladiator Sergius allegedly conducted relationships with several married noblewomen, generating massive controversies. Even more bizarrely, their bodily secretions were turned into products. Gladiator perspiration was gathered following battles, combined with olive extract, and marketed as a love potion and cosmetic treatment. Reflect on that degree of fame obsession. These are enslaved individuals whose sweat is being packaged and sold to the wealthy classes, but Rome existed in perpetual fear of these individuals. The Spartacus uprising, which occurred in 73 BC, was seared into Roman collective consciousness. 78 fighters had broken free, assembled an army of 70,000, and nearly destroyed Rome. For 2 years, they embarrassed army after army. When Rome ultimately defeated them, they executed 6,000 survivors through crucifixion along the Appian Way, one corpse every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, a landscape of crosses extending from Rome to Capua. That psychological wound never healed from the Roman mind. Each time a gladiator grasped a weapon, every lanista who operated a fighter academy, every observer in the viewing area, they all recalled that these individuals had once come frighteningly close to destroying Rome completely. So how do you manage incredibly dangerous, incredibly prized individuals who have genuine complaints and the fighting abilities to respond? You employ a mixture of harsh discipline and strategic incentives, additional food portions, award payments, liberation following sufficient triumphs. But the historical records suggest something additional, something more basic: entry to captured women. The evidence here is annoyingly fragmented. Roman authors reference it casually, as if it's too self-evident to detail thoroughly. But when you assemble mentions from Martial, Juvenal, and subsequent records, a design appears. Following an especially remarkable triumph, especially during the significant games financed by the ruler or rich politicians, gladiators who lived and performed admirably were granted what ancient records ambiguously call advantages of the champion. Contemporary scholars, interpreting context and comparing with what we understand about military compensation and slave administration, suspect this frequently meant entry to female prisoners kept under the arena. The procedure seems to have been disturbingly administrative. the gladiator would be escorted down into the hypogeum, the enormous underground maze under the arena surface, still dressed in his combat gear, still marked with the dirt and blood of the fighting ground. A ludus representative or an arena manager would serve as a guide. They'd proceed through passages illuminated by oil lamps, beyond the beast enclosures and the mechanical hoists, until they arrived at a particular area of detention chambers. These weren't ordinary prison spaces. Scientific findings from different amphitheaters throughout the territories, Capua, Pompeii, even under the Colosseum itself, show small rooms with specific characteristics: stone seating, metal loops secured into surfaces at waist level and close to the ground, entrances that secure from the exterior. Some chambers display proof of restraints permanently attached to the structure. The women detained in these spaces were labeled captivae damnatae, sentenced war prisoners. They'd already been catalogued through Rome's administration of conquest. Their identities were written in records by administrators named commentari who monitored state assets. Each woman received an identifier and a classification, determined by her homeland: Germanica, Britannica, Parthica. The gladiator would be presented a series of chambers. Some reports indicate he could select. Others suggest women were just allocated like tools being withdrawn from storage. Regardless, a sentry would open the specified chamber. The woman would be removed, or the gladiator would step inside. The entrance would be secured once more. What followed isn't depicted in precise terms in remaining records, but it doesn't require much speculation. The construction reveals the narrative the writings won't. Here's what makes this particularly sinister. This wasn't criminal conduct. It wasn't even considered morally problematic by most Romans. This was included in the operating expenses of the games. The organization of Victoria Carnalis was managed by the identical bureaucrats who arranged animal combat and serviced arena machinery. From the government's viewpoint, this arrangement addressed several issues elegantly. It compensated faithful gladiators inexpensively. Captured women required no state resources, as they were already designated as spoils of conquest. It strengthened the gladiator's feeling of status and advantage without truly providing him any genuine liberty or power, and it communicated a statement to both the gladiator and the defeated populations. This is what Roman supremacy signifies. Your triumph in the arena provides you the identical authority the emperor possesses, complete control over the vanquished. One Roman author, whose identity is forgotten but whose writings are referenced by subsequent historians, expressed it directly. The champion claims his compensation in the identical way the empire claims its territories, through right of domination. Let's examine the actual locations where this occurred, because the archaeological evidence is condemning. When researchers first dug beneath the Colosseum during the 1800s, they were chiefly interested in the remarkable construction, the lift mechanisms that raised beasts to ground level, the intricate passages for transporting staff and materials. But as excavations progressed, they discovered something they hadn't anticipated: specialized rooms that served no clear practical function. These chambers are compact, usually 10 to 15 square meters. They're positioned in a distinct area of the hypogeum, separated from beast cages and gladiator preparation areas. Their unique features are what make contemporary archaeologists uneasy. Stone benches border the surfaces, but unlike benches in other rooms, these are constructed at a particular elevation. Metal loops are embedded into the surfaces at various heights, some at ground level, some at waist level, some elevated. The entrances are thick timber strengthened with metal, and they secure from the exterior. The surfaces in multiple chambers display traces of scratching, desperate fingers attempting to claw through solid rock. The Roman chronicler Cassius Dio, composing in the 3rd century, references that under major amphitheaters were rooms for those waiting their employment. The wording is intentionally unclear, but within context, he's addressing the organization of the games, particularly the administration of human inventory. But the most unsettling proof originates from inscriptions. In the hypogeum under the amphitheater in Capua, the identical city where Spartacus began his revolt, researchers discovered scratch markings on chamber surfaces. Some are in Latin, others in dialects from throughout the territories. Most are incomplete, but several are readable. One inscribed in basic Latin by someone obviously not a native writer, converts approximately to, "I was Amelia of the Brigantes. I witnessed my offspring murdered. Now I am nothing." Another, in what seems to be Celtic, has been interpreted as, "To whatever deity who hears, let me perish before the next day." These aren't the perspectives history usually retains. Roman records identify emperors and commanders, document military conquests and construction accomplishments. They don't preserve the identities of conquered women listed as assets, but the structures recall. The construction itself communicates something essential. This operation was engineered for productivity and repetition. These weren't spontaneous assault sites. They were deliberately constructed, serviced installations with particular design characteristics, intended to enable what transpired within them. Compare this to how Rome managed other dimensions of gladiatorial operations, and the design becomes apparent. Gladiator housing, beast installations, weapon repositories. Every component of the arena foundation was thoughtfully designed and uniform throughout the territories. The captivity rooms matched the identical design. This was government-funded foundation for methodical abuse. Some historians contend we shouldn't interpret too much from these rooms, that they might have been utilized for different functions, that we're imposing contemporary worries onto unclear proof. But when you merge the construction with the written mentions, the design of Roman military tradition, and fundamental reasoning about how the operation worked, the image becomes agonizingly evident. Now we must face the most difficult aspect of this account, what this genuinely signified for the women confined in this operation. History is nearly entirely silent regarding their personal experiences. We don't possess journals, we don't possess accounts. What we possess are records that enumerate them as numbers and asset inventories that characterize them like livestock. Female Germanic, roughly 20 years, acceptable health allocated to Colosseum detention, but we can rebuild the nightmare from what we comprehend about the conquest sequence. These women weren't arbitrary captives, they originated from particular situations of absolute trauma. When Rome seized a territory that fought back, say during the Dacian campaigns, or the crushing of the Britannic uprising commanded by Boudicca, the consequence was systematic. Roman military guidelines determined that following the conclusive combat, the civilian population would be sorted. Males of fighting age were executed or enslaved for brutal work. Offspring under a specific age were divided and traded to slave markets in the Orient, where they'd never encounter their homeland or relatives again. Women of reproductive age were marked as captive and moved in chains to detention installations. For a woman in this circumstance, the passage to the arena was already a fall through successive levels of suffering. You'd observed your community destroyed, you'd witnessed your offspring ripped from your embrace, crying. You'd been shackled to numerous other women and forced to walk hundreds of miles to Rome. You'd been exposed, inspected like livestock, given an identifier and confined in a chamber under the greatest structure to the culture that obliterated everything you understood. The anticipation was its own type of agony. You could detect everything. The thunder of the audience overhead, as individuals you might have recognized were killed in imaginative methods for amusement. The cries of beasts being massacred. The celebrations when a gladiator executed a specifically skillful fatal strike, and you understood you'd never depart. There was no payment arrangement, no captive trade. Rome didn't bargain with the defeated. Your community back home, if they even lived, would never discover what occurred to you. You'd just vanish into the mechanism of empire. Then arrived the footsteps, the chamber entrance opening, the selection being executed, the entrance closing and securing again, with you on the incorrect side of it, with an individual who just dedicated the afternoon executing individuals for amusement. Roman legislation offered no safeguards. You couldn't petition to officials because lawfully you weren't an individual. You couldn't even take your own life. One of the limited escapes. Roman culture occasionally regarded with dignity, because if you somehow accomplished it, you'd be stealing from the government of its asset and your remains would still be utilized, just differently. This was mental combat on a civilizational magnitude. The degradation of conquered women wasn't a byproduct of Roman military strategy, it was an intentional approach. The objective was to shatter the will of opposition so completely that coming generations wouldn't even consider challenging Rome. Historical records make this clear. Following crushing the Jewish uprising in 70 AD, the chronicler Josephus documents that Romans intentionally seized Jewish women to be allocated among the armies and the games, particularly to prove to survivors that not only had they forfeited their independence, but they'd forfeited any capacity to defend their relatives. The communication was unambiguous. Challenge Rome, and this is what occurs to your daughters. But sometimes, this arrangement fractured in surprising methods. For all its mechanized brutality, Rome was fixated on preserving certain illusions about itself. The empire perceived itself as delivering culture and structure to the uncivilized realm. This self-perception demanded that certain horrors stay concealed, which leads us to an incident that compelled the arrangement into awkward visibility: female gladiators. On exceptionally uncommon instances, women battled in the arena itself. Historical records are divided regarding who these women were. Some were obviously enslaved people compelled to battle, but others seem to have been aristocratic women, who, in a society that granted women almost no independence, perceived the arena as a twisted type of authority and fame. The very presence of gladiatrices scandalized Rome's upper class. The satirist Juvenal composed with dripping disdain about aristocratic women who practiced with gladiator armaments, composing, "What feeling of modesty can be discovered in a woman who wears a helmet?" In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus witnessed games in Antioch that included female combatants. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was there, something surprising occurred. The Greek spectators responded with alarm and discomfort, handling the battles with the seriousness they'd grant male gladiators. But the Roman observers, they mocked, yelled sexual remarks, and handled the complete spectacle as an indecent mockery. The female combatants weren't perceived as warriors. They were perceived as a sexual exhibition, mistakenly positioned in a location designed for death combat. Severus was allegedly embarrassed not by the violence itself but by how crudely his fellow Romans responded. The respectability of the games, his propaganda instrument, was being damaged by the audience's failure to distinguish violence from sexuality when women were present, so he prohibited women from battling in the arena completely. Reflect on what this communicates. The issue wasn't defending women from violence. Female prisoners were still being detained in rooms under this identical arena. The issue was that the violence had become too apparent, too public, in a manner that made Rome's self-perception awkward. The emperor was acceptable with the abuse. He just desired it to occur in the darkness where it fit. The abuse didn't cease following Severus's prohibition. It just reverted to the shadows of the hypogeum, where it had always primarily functioned anyway. Here's what should genuinely alarm you. This arrangement didn't conclude with some moral realization. The games persisted for centuries. Even following Rome formally adopted Christianity in the 4th century, the gladiatorial games endured for decades. The final documented gladiatorial battle occurred in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus leaped into the arena to halt a combat and was ripped apart by an enraged audience. Only afterward did Emperor Honorius permanently prohibit gladiatorial combat, but even that didn't terminate the arrangement of detention under the arenas. The foundation persisted. The custom of seizing war prisoners persisted as standard military protocol throughout the Byzantine era. The arrangement ultimately disappeared not because of moral advancement, but because the Roman Empire itself crumbled. The apparatus of conquest ceased, so the supply of prisoners evaporated. The establishment perished from absence of resources, not from ethical development. Presently, when visitors tour the Colosseum, they capture photographs before magnificent arches and admire historical construction. Tour leaders discuss gladiatorial battle and beast hunts. Most never reference what occurred in the rooms below. The structures are still present. Those loops fastened into the surfaces haven't corroded away. The scratch markings from desperate fingers are still maintained under centuries of accumulation. The records that documented human beings as inventory pieces are preserved in Vatican collections and institutions throughout Europe. accessible to anyone who desires to examine them. We're not discussing a limited number of separate occurrences. This was strategy, this was foundation, this was ordinary. The Colosseum exists as a structure to what empire genuinely signifies. Not merely the impressive construction and military conquests we commemorate, but the mechanized horror necessary to sustain absolute authority. Every structure in that arena was purchased with more than currency. It was purchased with existences intentionally destroyed in the most methodical methods humans have ever created. The exhibition on the surface was only the portion of it that Rome desired you to observe. The other portion occurred in those rooms under your position, in the instance after the audience's thunder diminished into quietness. Those perspectives, the ones that weren't intended to be maintained, the ones Roman writers didn't consider worth documenting, are still present in those surfaces if you're prepared to hear. And that's the account they don't present in history lessons. If this revealed something you've never encountered before, press that subscribe button and activate notifications, because we're going to persist revealing the history they attempted to eliminate. Leave a comment with your reflections and I'll encounter you in the following investigation into the most disturbing aspects of the past.